welcome to today's episode of Rise Up Voices from the Frontlines. My name is Krista Fee, and I'll be your host. And today I'm bringing to you a guest from a side of first responding that I'm extraordinarily familiar with. And this is the first time that we've actually had a guest on here that is from the crisis intervention and crisis response world. So I would like to welcome Kelly Moore, Senior Safety Specialist.
Thank you. Glad to be
Hi,
here.
So this is a topic that a lot of people don't like to talk about, but a lot of people are really, really afraid is going to happen to them. So one of the topics that we're going to talk about today is school shootings and the work that you're doing to help prepare and prevent and respond to those types of instances. How comfortable are you in just having these conversations in the normal world?
Very comfortable. I think we have to have these discussions as many of us try to avoid them. I think we have to have them. It builds resilience. It builds responsibility, expectation, all of these things that are crucial when you're having your worst day.
Right. This is not an ignore it and it will go away problem.
And it's not a one and done thing. This is something that we are going to be experiencing probably well past my lifetime.
So tell us a little bit about you when you were younger and what brought you to this place in your life where you're doing this particular work.
So I'll acknowledge that I only have about a half hour, 45 minutes here, so I won't go all the way back to when I was younger. But I've always been interested in law enforcement. My college education went into law enforcement, and then I began my career back in 1984 with the Sheriff's Department in Southern California. And then, as luck would have it, I guess, I was able to advance through up to the command staff, where I was lucky enough, I think, fortunate enough, blessed, however you want to say that, to spend a significant amount of time in the emergency management, incident management, and crisis response realm. And I retired about 5 years ago now. Wow. And then I started working for a school district. And I took what I learned to try to help them with their safety program. And shortly after that, I now work for a company that provides software and emergency management apps and stuff for K-12, the K-12 environment. So, one of the things that really got me passionate about this later part was I was actually the incident commander for a significant active shooter in a small town right next to our college. And I didn't do it correctly. I made a lot of mistakes. We made a lot of mistakes. And understanding that we needed to learn how to do this better, I took up educating myself on that.
I have noticed as I researched this, all of the recommendations and all of the suggestions and all of the standards, that this is a topic that is still being studied. It's still not fully understood. We don't have a profile of what kids are the highest risk. We don't have one singular standardized protocol for what we're supposed to teach kids and what we're supposed to teach schools and what we're supposed to teach parents. Mm-hmm. All of this is still kind of being negotiated in the systems. So how important is it that people educate themselves as much as possible? And what tools and resources do you think are the best for people to look at?
So, it just baffles me. We are 24 years past law enforcement. safety, consider the watershed moment of Columbine. And um, we're still learning. And I think we should be learning, but we're not really making any progress. We're learning about what happened before, but we're not implementing, we're not um, uh, innovating to the point where our kids are safe. And one of the issues that we have is a lot of the so-called solutions that we're seeing are politically motivated, not necessarily response based or prevention based, where we can really look at what it is that we want our schools, our teachers, our communities to do to prevent this violence. And you know, again, 24 years past Columbine, and our teachers are still looking at us and saying, this isn't my job. I didn't get into teaching to do this. Well, you may not have, but um, uh, you're here and this is part of your responsibility. So why don't we use your education expertise and become students of this ourselves? And why don't we figure this out ourselves? You know, we've seen what are prescribed as the standard from the the federal government and so forth. And I think the federal government should, but what we're seeing is not necessarily based in reality for the K-12 environment. And we all know about the standard of run, hide, fight, but in the K-12 environment, that's not practical. I mean, it's an option, absolutely an option, but using that as our standard is not necessarily what we should be doing. I mean, uh, we've talked before, and having, uh, I asked this question: where's the best place for you to be during a school shooting? Obvious answer is
Anywhere
somewhere.
but here.
So, in order to do that, we would typically have to run in the run, hide, fight, right? The problem is now try translating that to educational environment where teachers are responsible for sometimes upwards of 40, 50 kids, and trying to get them all in a safe place by running away from where they're at. It's not practical. So is it an option? Yes. But this is what's causing some of the confusion in this industry: is what are our standards, what is the solution, and how do we do this?
So one of the things that we've learned early on is that panic, uh, parental interference, community interference, parking, all of these things that happen in the middle of a crisis, not even just a school shooting, but crisis in general. The tendency of people is to want to go to the scene and do something.
Mm-hmm.
What do you have to say about those patterns and what can we do differently?
So, first of all, we have to educate our parents and our community. When you have any significant event, especially an act of violence at a school campus, law enforcement, the fire departments, our first responders are all going to shut down that campus. You're not going to be able to get there. And responding to the campus as a concerned parent or a community member or what have you, I understand that urge, but we got to educate them to say, look, at all you're doing is complicating things. You're becoming part of the problem, not part of the solution. And we need to educate them on what we want them to do. So we need to communicate with them what we want them to do. And that is essentially stay home until you get word where we want you to go. We should be telling them what information we have currently. We'll update them regularly and stand by for instructions. And we have to be very specific about where to go to get that information, because we understand how much misinformation in today's age is put out there. And, when we start talking about preparing for this, and working through this, you know, I use the term, if you want peace, you have to prepare for war, right? And in doing that, that doesn't mean you have to prepare in such a way that you're going to do harm to people, right? And I think we have to be very cognizant of how we respond, how we manage incidences is likely to cause more trauma to those involved than the actual incident, that very short period of time, that 5, 6, 7, 10 minutes, that very short period of time in the overall scheme of the incident. If we don't manage that bigger picture, then we're going to have a lot more issues to deal with for a lot longer period of time.
Part of the issues that you're talking about are the post-traumatic stress responses and the fear and and increased injuries and things like that that could have been avoided. Is that, am I reading you correctly?
Yeah. So, you know, we've seen many incidences where um, you have a school that handles it very well. And you know, sure, there's going to be a level of trauma, a level of anxiety, post-trauma, level of injuries, you know, all of that, you know, the physical and emotional, mental trauma that we have in crisis. You can't avoid it completely. But when you have those well-managed incidences, that trauma is pretty much um, mitigated once the incident is over, because everyone is they're seeing what they expect to see, and they're seeing things that make sense to them. But if we mismanage that, and they're questioning, well, why aren't we doing this? Why is this taking so long? Why aren't is my kid not in front of me right now? We've been here for 4 hours. There hasn't been a shot fired for 4 hours. And all we're doing is increasing that trauma. So if we prepare to manage this correctly, I think we've said this before, is um, if we have, generally speaking, there's several incidences we can point to, but generally speaking, if um, we have an incident of an active shooter, our initial responders will handle that fairly well and fairly quickly. That's a problem that's, for law enforcement, is easily solved if they're allowed to, right? But the management of that incident will go on for often days, years, depending on how well it's managed, right? Um, and uh, if we don't recognize that and we don't put that into our planning and our preparations, then it's going to be an issue, and we're going to have to deal with that whether we like it or not. So I think we can pretty much engineer the trauma out of this, the unexpected trauma. Expected, we can deal with that. We can prepare for that. But when you're talking about 20 law enforcement professionals that aren't allowed to do what they're trained to do because they haven't gotten the okay to go, that's a huge issue. And that's going to be something that's going to affect everybody. And we've witnessed that in recent years.
So one of the steps that you're talking about in the aftermath is the role that I play, the psychological first aid,
Mm-hmm.
debriefing, and that covers the first responders that responded to the situation
Mm-hmm.
and the students that experienced it and the teachers and coordinators and everyone else that's involved. But that usually doesn't come the day of the situation. So, what steps are you talking about immediately following the law enforcement doing their process and children being returned to the parents?
So um, some of those can happen that day. And if you plan for that and you support them during the reunification, just knowing who you're going to have to target for services and support tomorrow is a big issue, right? Um, it, and this is what I'm saying we should do no harm, or the least amount of harm that we can during the planning process. The recovery starts long before the incident is over. We should be looking at how we are treating everybody. Are we doing what we're expected to do? Are we living up to expectations and understanding our responsibilities? But if I know that the incident is going to create trauma level X, and I can prepare for that. And if I know that the at some point I'm going to have to reunify kids with their families, and I have a good formal process with that, then I can allow and account for counseling as part of the reunification process. So while their kids are sitting there in an assembly area waiting for their parents to come pick them up and to be reunified, I can have trained staff looking for those who are having adverse reaction to what happened.
Right.
And I can pull them out and say, "Are you okay?" And based upon their response, you can either send them back or you can send them to, an immediate grief counselor who can take their information so that you can check up on them tomorrow with a phone call or a visit or what have you, whatever the appropriate level of care is and support is. But if I don't plan for that and I just send the kids away, then now I'm going to have to stand up a grief center, and I'm going to have all of these things in place for weeks to come, hoping that they're going to show up. But if I know that they're there and I know they're having issues, and this goes for the staff as well, this isn't just the students. And do I have people in the parent assembly area looking for parents who are not handling this correctly, right? Or as expected. So, there's ways to mitigate this from the very get-go. And, I'm a big advocate of the I Love You Guys Foundation and their processes, the standard response protocols and the standard reunification method. And, from their processes, they include that in there. They include the ability to have interviews, counseling, all of these different aspects. And, they like to say, recovery starts when the event starts. If we do it correctly, if we wait till the end before we start the reunification process and the recovery process, all you're doing is prolonging the inevitable. You're going to have to do this. You're prolonging it, and you're prolonging the time frame which people are going to start feeling more trauma and be more likely exposed to trauma.
So, with all of your observations and experiences, what are you doing now that is helping to mitigate this problem?
So um, my primary function with the company I work for, Crisis Go, is to educate teachers, the education administrators, the safety teams on what it is that they should be doing to mitigate all of this stuff, and trying to figure out how we can educate them what it means to be safe and what it means to get there. Because right now we're at this crossroads. Let's say that. I'm not sure we're actually at the crossroads, but we're at a point where um, teachers and school systems are buying into, in order for you to be safe, you need a panic button. And you press this panic button that goes directly to law enforcement or the fire department, to whomever you need. You press that button and you're going to be safe. The problem is that's only the first step. That doesn't make you safe. And if you have to press that button, it's already too late, right? The event has already started. So I'm looking at trying to educate people from what is known in many, especially the military, but more and more in law enforcement. What happens, what they call left of bang, before the incident is triggered? What happens before that? And what can we do to, one, prevent it from ever happening? And what can we do to mitigate it should it happen? And that includes counseling, psychological and emotional support, and all of these things that we can set up to make them more resilient. And, one of my biggest challenges is to answer this question: why do we have to drill in active shooter situations? That causes trauma. And my response to that is, imagine having an active shooter in your building and you have never experienced the drill and you have no idea what to do. Even if you understand lockdown, okay, I need lockdown. But what if you're at lunch when that happens and you're not just sitting in the classroom when it happens? What if you're out at recess, you're out at the football game or whatever? So can you imagine the trauma created by experiencing an active shooter for the first time and not knowing anything about what to do? I'm not a trauma professional, but even I can think and imagine that that's not a good picture.
Right. There's a huge part of feeling out of control that is an element of how powerful the reaction is going to be in someone. So these kids who are prepared and habituated to do certain things, to take certain actions, are going to be more protected psychologically than kids who panic and don't know what they're doing. And that sense of being out of control is going to make them more at risk. We do know that much.
Right. So what we're talking about is building resilience, right? A more resilient staff, a more resilient student population, more resilient community, because we look at doing these drills, these common drills, lockdown, secure, evacuate, shelter, hold. We look at doing those, but we're very short-sighted on the effects of teaching that properly. And what I mean by short-sighted is we generally we imagine it as, this is all while you're in school. But we know that a pretty big and significant majority of all acts of violence occur outside of the school. So what we really should be doing is training our population to respond to acts of violence anywhere, not just in your school and not just while you're attending a school activity, but anywhere. And we really need to have these skills, stop the bleed, understanding where and when to shelter, do whatever, take some sort of emergency protective action, whatever that is to you. But if you don't train that and you don't understand that we're teaching, we should be teaching a life skill, then we're going to have more and more fatalities. Because one of the things that is occurring is, I think the emergency services professionals are learning fairly well on what's going on. It's part of their natural process to do after action reviews. I'm not sure the school settings are in line with that just yet. And, until we get there, we're going to keep experiencing these things.
So you have a big focus on prevention, and part of that is looking at um, vulnerable children
Mm-hmm.
and what kids are at risk for becoming dangerous. And I know I'm supposed to say that we don't have a profile for an actual profile for school shooters, but what we do
Mm-hmm.
know is they tend to be kids who don't feel like they belong, who
Mm-hmm.
don't feel like they're a part of something, and who feel like they've been ostracized from other students for some reason or another, whether
Mm-hmm.
it's true or whether it's perceived. So, what, in your experience, can we do to improve our awareness of risk factors and to protect the kids that are vulnerable and keep this from happening?
Yeah. So, you know, I I use this term because it's familiar, and what we should be doing is looking at um, concerning behaviors within our student population. And the term that we should be doing threat assessments, and we should be doing them correctly. We should train them. We should teach them. And but the problem is currently we are waiting way too long to do the quote threat assessment. We typically do that when we receive a threat about a student, and um, uh, what we're trying to do is identify the level of threat and what we need to do to prevent this threat from being carried out. Typically, we're doing that in the secondary school level, either late middle school, early high school, right? The problem is the causation of that ideology of threatening behavior started in elementary school. Kids were being bullied, they're victimized, or whatever they have. And, um, you know, threat assessments really should be utilized more in not what is currently a threat, but what the potential for threat is. And if we start identifying uh, behaviors as soon as possible, and I'm not excluding kindergarten, if we look at concerning behavior and we don't address concerning behavior, and that child continues to matriculate through their academic career, and nobody's addressed it because they've said, oh, that's just schoolyard behavior, that's just Johnny being Johnny, then, and we don't address that appropriately at the earliest stage, every time we don't address that, it becomes harder and harder to address down the road from a non-professional's point of view. And and I've had principals do threat assessments on first graders, and uh, there was an incident between a first grader and a fourth grader. And they asked me what I should do. I said, you should do a threat assessment. Are you kidding me? First grader and a fourth grader? I says, yes. And I won't go into the whole story, but it really is about both of those children, the first grader and the fourth grader, exhibiting bullying behavior towards each other. And it's not about the threat that was made. The younger one threatened to kill the older one, which was the threat, right? It was really about intervening and stopping that cycle of bullying before it becomes a continued and reinforced behavior. And we have to address both of them and not just one of them, um, because the situation was such that the fourth grader was the instigator until the first grader made the threat. And um, the fourth grader claimed, I'm just a victim here. You came at that younger child with from a position of power. That's a bullying situation. So I, I don't think it is ever too early to start addressing concerning behavior. And I think we have to do that better.
I have heard people say teaching children social skills may be helpful in the scenario. So empathy and connection and communication and all of these, what we call soft skills as adults, that we don't actually really purposefully teach children how to interact with each other correctly. Do you think there's an element of prevention that could come from a shift in programming to some of those softer skills?
Yeah, absolutely. Conflict resolution, problem solving, socialization is a real thing. There's a very large challenge here because of our addiction to the internet and these devices where kids, are on these devices as early as 1 and 2 years old as babysitting devices, and they think this is healthy, but they're not getting the socialization that is natural at those age. They're not going to preschool. They're not going to daycare. They're not going to these things because we have this little device in front of them, and they're watching. It's been a long time since I watched kids programming on those, but you get where I'm going at it
Yeah.
with this is this is a good healthy thing for my child. Is it? Because they're not really interacting, and I think we're seeing some of the product of that now that was exacerbated by the pandemic. Is we're seeing kids that were marginally social beforehand. They got isolated for a year or more, and then all of a sudden, we're seeing the effects of being isolated for a long period of time, and that is concerning everybody, not just academically but emotionally.
So I know this is a super controversial topic, and there's a lot of research that goes both directions. Do you, in your opinion, because I know that you just have to go opinion here, do you feel like exposure to the massive amount of violence that our kids are being exposed to through media and video games has any influence whatsoever? Like, does this play a part in this problem?
So I've been asked this question many times. So here's my response. And we've talked about Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman, and his theories on gaming and the effects they have on children. And, this is one of those things where you have there's enough, you have some evidence that it does influence kids, and you have evidence that it doesn't influence kids. And I think that those kids who are susceptible to being influenced are going to be influenced. And I'll give you an example. I don't think those games make kids violent. I do think that if they're going to be violent anyway, it makes them better at it, if that makes sense. And I'll give you an example. My son, who was 10 at the time, I asked him what he wanted for his birthday, and paintball was just coming up, and he wanted a paintball set so that the two of us could go paintballing, or he could go paintballing with his friends. And so we got some paintballs, and we went to this place in the area that I lived, and we went out and started shooting at each other. And we had rules. They weren't always followed, but we had rules. And as we're going and we're starting to search for each other, I couldn't find him. He's a 10-year-old kid. And all of a sudden, he tags me. And I said, okay, we're done. And that was one of the rules. If you get shot, you have to stop and regroup. Because I wanted to check to make sure there weren't any injuries, right? But he got me. And I look up and he's at the high ground behind cover. And he's 10 years old. I said, where did you learn to do that? That's a more advanced tactical maneuver. And he goes, video games. That's what we do in video games. So the reason I'm saying that is because it didn't make him a violent person, and he's not a violent person to this day, but he was much better tactically because he learned this from that. So that's my take on this. And I do think that one of the things, when we start talking about the prevention and where people are on the pathway to violence, I do think violent video games, if you are one of those kids who have been identified as a potential threat, I do think you transition on that pathway to violence quicker. And because there's a big step between the grievance stage or the victimization stage. I've added that to the pathway to violence. I've added that because there's steps before the grievance. So the victimization turns into a grievance that goes into violent ideation. I think video games and such give them this idea that violence can be a solution. And so does it have an effect? Yes. Do I think it makes kids violent? I don't think it does. But if you're prone to becoming violent, I think it certainly helps you push along that road.
We could almost look at it the same as the suicide prevention model, that step of rehearsal is kind of where that might fall in to play, in that if you're already thinking suicidal thoughts, you may take preparatory rehearsal type actions. So a kid who is prone to violence may be using video games as a way to visualize the potential outcomes and to practice what it might be like. Sure. And to get comfortable with the experience.
Yeah. So when we're talking about prevention and suicide, there's one thing and I'll ask your opinion on this, because generally speaking, in the school setting, we treat suicide risk and threat risk separately. And I've instructed my staff and my schools that I consult with. I've instructed them you really have to be very careful with when you start looking at suicidal ideation. You also have to be aware of the threat to others, because for me, it's a very short bridge to cross from being suicidal to being homicidal. And in fact, there's evidence that there are online channels that encourage people who are suicidal to become homicidal as well.
Yeah, there is. I like the way you phrase that, because we don't want to say there is definitely an association, but there is a short bridge. And really, what is causing the person to feel like their life is not worth living? Mm-hmm. It's often the same causations. It's the same pathway. So what's the switch between the two, whether I choose to take my life or whether I choose to take others with me? Mm-hmm. The cause and effect, the risk, all of the different things that people use to make decisions. What is the punishment going to be if I choose that pathway? Well, if I'm not here, it doesn't much matter, does it?
Right.
Like, I'm
Right.
not getting punished. So what's the deterrence?
Right. And the other side of that is, if a suicidal person is thinking my life is not worth it, not worth living any longer, and it doesn't matter, my life doesn't matter, right? If I take people with me, at least it mattered at that point, right? And so, um, that's where I believe that we we have to look at things not so much in a silo that are separate, but are they relational, and how relational is everything that we do in the prevention side. So I am heavy on prevention, but I'm also heavy on the other side, because I think we have to balance that. And when I mean the other side, I'm talking about the other side of bang, the right side after something happens. How are we responding? How are we managing those incidences? Because you never, ever, even though it happens more times, probably 90% of the time, you never really want to have the worst day in your life as a school administrator to be the first time that you've talked to your fire department, your police departments, your hospitals, as to what we're going to do. Because seconds do matter, minutes matter, and the longer it takes for you to figure that out, the more trauma you are causing, whether it's physical, emotional, psychological, or what have you. If you are really wasting your time trying to figure out what you're going to do next, then you're wasting, literally, you're wasting people's lives.
So how can people get a hold of you or your
Um,
organization?
so uh, Kelly Moore at crisisgo.com. My phone number, my cell phone number is area code 805-689-9629. And I'm happy to talk to anybody about uh, these processes that I engage in. And I'm happy to really, I don't charge for my service. My company pays me to do this, to educate the public and educate law enforcement, fire departments, school systems, municipalities. That's what they pay me to do. So I also, on crisisgo.com, we have a blog series for education, a blog and podcast. And my podcast is Coffee with Kelly, and you can get that wherever podcasts are housed, whatever that means.
Right, like us on all the different streaming things you can't even keep track anymore.
Right, right.
Well, I know that your time is short with us today, so I want to thank you so much for being here and talking about this uncomfortable topic that is so absolutely necessary. And are there any last words that you would want, like words of wisdom or?
I I guess we started off with the best wisdom that I could give somebody is you have to become a student of uh, this topic. If you're responsible for the care and safety of our kids, and or responding to an incident, law enforcement understand the differences between the schools and everything else that we do. But if you become a student of this, everyone becomes a student. We don't necessarily need a standard, because we will know what the options are given our unique set of circumstances, and we can respond, and we can do that quickly, and you can literally save lives. My time in the schools, I characterize as probably the most rewarding part of my job that I've ever done, because it was the most proactive that I did to protect my community. Everything else was in response to. So if we get involved with our schools and our schools' safety, then, and we know what we're talking about, then there's nothing better.
I love that. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you, everybody, for listening to this episode of Rise Up Voices from the Frontline. I hope that you took some valuable information that you can apply, and I hope that you will reach out and be proactive in all of your mental health and wellness for your body, mind, spirit, for your family, for your community. There's so much that we can do ahead of time to keep everybody happier and healthier. So, again, thank you so much for being with us today. If you love this podcast and you want to support us, you can make a tax deductible donation at BATTLE, the number 2, BE.org, battle2b.org. And that helps us keep this podcast going and provide mental health and wellness response and care for our military and frontline first responders, as well as for our vulnerable youth populations. Thank you so much and have an amazing day.